A group of cops aggressively arrests a black man with a backpack, convinced he's a terrorist. They ignore his explanations, escalating the situation in front of a crowd. But when the truth is finally revealed, the officers realize they've made a serious mistake. He's with the FBI. Now, the tables have turned, and the consequences are unavoidable. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The international airport was buzzing with life, a constant ebb and flow of people moving in every direction. The echo of footsteps, the distant hum of voices, and the steady stream of announcements from overhead speakers filled the massive space. It was a typical day, yet for Eric it felt anything but ordinary. He moved with purpose, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the crowded terminal. Dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, he blended in with the rest of the travelers, keeping his identity hidden. The airport's security presence was stronger than usual. Armed guards patrolled the entranceways, their eyes sharp as they watched the incoming waves of passengers. The atmosphere, although not visibly tense, carried an undercurrent of heightened alertness. Eric felt it immediately. It was the kind of tension that hung in the air when something big was brewing, the calm before a storm. He adjusted the straps of the small backpack on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the documents inside. They weren't just any documents. They were classified, top-level materials for an operation of critical importance. His team, scattered among the crowd, had already briefed him on the status of their preparation. Everything was in motion, and all that was left was for Eric to give the final go-ahead. But first, he needed to confirm a few details and ensure that nothing had been overlooked. Passing through the security checkpoint without drawing any attention, Eric made his way to the waiting area near the departure gates. He found an empty bench, its cold metal surface a stark contrast to the warmth of the bustling crowds around him. He set his backpack down carefully, ensuring it was placed in a position where he could easily keep an eye on it, and walked over to a small cafe to get coffee. The caffeine would help him stay sharp. He needed his full attention for the hours ahead. As the barista prepared his order, Eric allowed his mind to wander briefly. He thought about the mission, about the pressure and expectations weighing on him. This operation had the potential to prevent a disaster, and, as the lead, every decision he made could make or break it. Failure wasn't an option, not just because of the stakes involved, but because Eric had something to prove. Despite his years of experience, his authority was often questioned. Not overtly, of course, at least not directly to his face, but he had seen the looks, felt the subtle skepticism, the quiet doubts about his capabilities lingering just beneath the surface. It wasn't something he could pin on a single moment, but rather an accumulation of incidents. Being a black man in a high-stakes leadership position had always come with a unique set of challenges. It was never just about the job. It was about constantly proving himself over and over again to those who judged him before they even knew him. The coffee arrived, and Eric took a deep breath, savoring the brief moment of calm. He would need every ounce of composure to navigate the day ahead. Returning to the bench where he had left his bag, his eyes quickly scanned the area. Everything seemed normal. The passengers were preoccupied with their own schedules. Families with children tugging at their sleeves, business travelers glued to their phones, and tourists struggling with maps and directions. Eric sat down, taking a slow sip of his coffee, allowing his senses to remain alert despite the casual posture he maintained. His team was in place, and he trusted them. They had trained for months for this moment, rehearsing every possible scenario. But still, as the leader, it was his responsibility to ensure the mission went off without a hitch. Any oversight, no matter how small, could spell disaster. The clock above the gate ticked forward, and Eric's mind ran through a mental checklist. Communication channels were clear, transportation was secured, and every operative was in their designated position. He would need to coordinate with his point of contact in the security services, but that could wait until he was ready to move. For now, it was just about staying calm, staying focused, and waiting for the right moment to execute. As he took another sip of coffee, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A message from his second-in-command. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Eric responded with a simple confirmation, knowing that his team was fully aware of the significance of the operation. This wasn't just about completing a mission. This was about proving once again that they were capable of handling the most delicate and dangerous situations. Leaning back slightly, Eric allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. His path to this point hadn't been easy. It was filled with hurdles, many of them coming from places he hadn't expected. The biggest challenge, however, had always been fighting against the bias that others held toward him. Even when he had proven himself time and time again, there were still whispers, quiet doubts in the minds of those who couldn't see past his skin color. But Eric had learned long ago not to let that stop him. He had risen above it, becoming one of the most respected leaders in his field. Still, moments like this reminded him of how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. But there was no time for dwelling on the past. Today was about the mission. Eric finished his coffee and stood up, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that always came before a major operation. He was ready. The world around him carried on, oblivious to the magnitude of what was about to happen, and that was exactly how it needed to stay. Grabbing his backpack, Eric made his way toward the terminal's information desk, where he would rendezvous with one of his team members. The clock was ticking, and soon everything would be set into motion. As he neared the bench where he had left his bag just moments ago, his step faltered. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made him pause. Several police officers and airport security staff had gathered around the bench, their faces tight with urgency. His backpack was no longer just a bag. It was now the center of their attention, surrounded by yellow caution tape. Eric's pulse quickened as he realized what had happened. In his efforts to remain incognito, he had made a rookie mistake, leaving a bag unattended in an airport, especially in a time of heightened security. He walked faster, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was a misunderstanding, something that could be cleared up quickly, but he would have to handle it carefully. The last thing he needed was to draw unwanted attention, especially now. As he approached the scene, one of the officers glanced in his direction, already sizing him up. Eric could see the suspicion in their eyes, a look he had seen all too often. This was about to get complicated. Eric's heart thudded heavily in his chest as he neared the bench. The scene before him wasn't just routine security. It was a full-blown response. Several officers stood around, radios crackling as they spoke in low, urgent voices. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Yellow caution tape fenced off the bench where Eric had left his backpack, and the curious gazes of travelers had already started to gather. Phones were out, cameras rolling, passengers whispering in speculation. Eric steadied himself, inhaling deeply. The backpack was a simple, everyday item, nothing suspicious. But in today's world, unattended luggage was always seen as a potential threat, and protocol dictated immediate action. He knew that approaching this situation calmly and logically would be the only way to defuse it. However, experience warned him that logic didn't always prevail, especially when biases clouded judgment. As he stepped closer to the scene, one of the officers noticed him. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a security uniform turned toward him, his expression immediately hardening. "Stop right there, sir," the officer ordered, raising a hand. "This area is off-limits." "That's my bag," Eric responded evenly, maintaining eye contact without appearing confrontational. "I left it here while I grabbed a coffee." The officer's expression didn't change. Instead, his eyes narrowed, scanning Eric from head to toe. His gaze lingered a moment too long, assessing Eric's appearance: dark skin, casual clothing, and unassuming demeanor. It was the kind of look Eric knew well, a silent assumption that often came before trouble. "You left your bag unattended," another officer chimed in, stepping forward with an air of authority. He was shorter, but carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to giving orders. "That's a serious security breach." "I understand," Eric said, keeping his voice level. "It was an oversight. I just went to grab a coffee. I'm back now, so there's no need for concern." The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism palpable. A third officer, standing near the bag, leaned over and spoke quietly into his radio. The tension grew thicker, the conversation between the officers becoming more pointed. "You'll need to provide identification," the first officer said sharply, folding his arms. "And an explanation for why you thought it was okay to leave a bag like that in a crowded airport." Eric reached slowly into his jacket pocket for his wallet, careful not to make any sudden moves. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. He handed over his ID, feeling the weight of their stares as they inspected it. "What brings you to this airport today?" the second officer asked, his tone accusatory. "I'm here on business," Eric replied. He kept his words deliberately vague, knowing that revealing too much could complicate things. His work was classified, and the fewer details he gave, the better. "That's not much of an answer," the shorter officer shot back, his voice laced with suspicion. "What kind of business are you in?" Eric knew where this was going. The questions weren't about protocol anymore. They were about power, about control. The officers were establishing dominance, making it clear that, in their eyes, he was just another suspect. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the nature of my business," Eric said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "But if you contact the airport's operations team, they'll confirm my clearance." The officers didn't like that answer. Their expressions darkened, and the air grew heavier with unspoken tension. The first officer stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space. "That's not how this works," he said coldly. "You're going to tell us what you're doing here, or we'll have no choice but to treat you as a threat." Eric felt the familiar surge of frustration, a wave of emotions he had learned to control over the years. The silent accusation, the unwarranted suspicion. It was a story he had lived through many times before. But this time, the stakes were higher. Any misstep could jeopardize not only his mission, but his freedom. He opened his mouth to respond, but the officer raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it," the officer snapped. "Step aside. We're going to search your bag." Eric clenched his jaw but complied, stepping back as they moved toward his backpack. The passengers around them murmured in hushed voices, their curiosity turning to unease. Eric knew the optics of the situation were working against him. A black man being questioned by security over an unattended bag. It was a narrative that people were quick to assume. The officers huddled around the backpack, one of them pulling on a pair of gloves. They opened the main compartment slowly, as if expecting to uncover something dangerous. Eric stood silently, his hands at his sides, watching as they rifled through his belongings. They found nothing unusual, just clothes, toiletries, and a few personal items. But the documents, sealed in an envelope marked confidential, caught their attention. "What's this?" the shorter officer asked, holding up the envelope with a triumphant smirk, as if he had just uncovered incriminating evidence. "Those are classified documents," Eric replied calmly. "I can't allow you to open them without the proper clearance." The officers exchanged glances again, their expressions hardening. "Classified, huh?" the first officer sneered. "And we're just supposed to take your word for that?" Eric knew this was spiraling out of control. He needed to de-escalate the situation before things got worse. But before he could speak, the officer turned to his colleague. "Call for backup," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We've got ourselves a situation here." Eric's stomach tightened. This wasn't just an inquiry anymore. It was becoming an incident, one that could quickly escalate beyond his control. "I'd advise against that," Eric said quietly but firmly. "This is a misunderstanding. I need you to contact the operations team immediately. They'll explain everything." The officers ignored him, already speaking into their radios. "Sir," the first officer said, turning back to Eric, "I'm going to need you to cooperate fully. Hands behind your head, now." Eric's heart pounded as the weight of the situation settled over him. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before, lived it before, but no amount of experience could dull the sting of being treated like a criminal based solely on appearances. He raised his hands slowly, the frustration burning in his chest. As he did, he noticed the growing crowd of onlookers, their phones raised, capturing every moment. This was no longer just about a backpack. It was about perception, power, and prejudice. "Is this really necessary?" Eric asked, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. The officer's response was a sharp tug on his arm, forcing him to turn around. Eric didn't resist as they pushed him against a wall, but the humiliation cut deeper than any physical restraint. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, and in that moment, he knew the conflict was only just beginning. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Eric's wrists as the officers tightened them with unnecessary force. The small crowd of passengers gathered around, whispering among themselves, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. A few phones were already recording, cameras trained on every movement, every word exchanged between the officers and their suspect. Eric kept his breathing steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him agitated. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way, but the sting of humiliation was just as sharp as it had been the first time. This was supposed to be a routine part of his day, a check-in with his team before the mission's launch. Now he was on the floor of an airport, his hands locked behind his back, treated as a threat because of an unattended bag, and because of who they assumed him to be. "Face down," one officer ordered, pressing Eric onto the cold tile floor. The officer's knee dug into his back, adding unnecessary pressure. Eric gritted his teeth. He knew better than to resist. Resisting would only make things worse. That was always the unspoken rule. Any sign of defiance, no matter how minor, would be seen as aggression. "This is a mistake," Eric said evenly, though his voice was muffled against the floor. "I've explained everything. You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Yeah, we've heard that one before," the taller officer sneered, standing over him like a triumphant hunter over his prey. The shorter officer, who had been handling the radio, looked down at Eric with a mix of suspicion and disdain. You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want? Not on our watch. Eric exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. The insults, the rough treatment, they were all part of a performance, a way to assert dominance and remind him of his place in their eyes. But Eric knew he had to stay focused. Any lapse in control could jeopardize everything. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd as passengers voiced their discomfort. Some spoke in hushed tones about racial profiling, while others questioned the officer's excessive use of force. One woman's voice rose above the others. "Is this really necessary? He's not even resisting." But the officers paid no attention to the crowd. They were locked in, feeding off their own authority. One of them grabbed Eric's phone from his pocket and pocketed it without a word. "You're going to explain yourself," the shorter officer said, leaning in close, his voice low and threatening. "And if you don't, we'll make sure this ends badly for you." Eric met his gaze without flinching, though anger simmered just below the surface. He had learned long ago how to navigate situations like this. Anger would only fuel their power. Calm was his weapon. Control was his strength. "You'll find out soon enough who I am," Eric replied quietly, with an edge to his voice. "And when you do, I hope you're ready to answer for this." The officer smirked, unimpressed. "That a threat?" "No," Eric said flatly. "It's a promise." Just then, another officer arrived, one carrying a small black device in hand. The radio buzzed with static, and the officer gave a quick update to his colleagues. "Supervisor's on his way. Told us to hold the suspect here until he arrives." The officers exchanged looks of satisfaction, as if this development confirmed their suspicions. "Good," the taller officer muttered. "Let's see how much longer he keeps that attitude when the supervisor gets here." Eric shifted slightly, adjusting to the discomfort of the cuffs and the weight pressing on his back. His mind was racing, running through scenarios, calculating his next move. He needed to contact his team, but with his phone confiscated, that option was gone. He felt the edge of helplessness creeping in, but he pushed it aside. No room for doubt, no room for fear. The minutes dragged on. Around him, the crowd grew restless. People shuffled their feet, glancing from the officers to Eric and back again, unsure whether to intervene or simply continue filming. A part of Eric was glad for the cameras. They were witnesses, even if silent ones. Whatever happened here, it wouldn't go unseen. One officer knelt beside him, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "What's the matter? Didn't think we'd catch you?" Eric didn't respond. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Then, as if on cue, the shorter officer leaned in and whispered something vile under his breath. It wasn't loud enough for the crowd to hear, but it was loud enough for Eric to catch every word, a racial slur laced with contempt and cruelty. A surge of emotion flared within him, hotter and sharper than anything he had felt in a long time. For a brief moment, he felt the urge to lash out, to fight back against the indignity of it all, but just as quickly as the anger came, he forced it down. Not here. Not like this. The officer smirked, satisfied with the reaction he had provoked, however brief it had been. He stood up and dusted off his hands as if dealing with Eric was nothing more than routine. The seconds stretched into minutes, and still the supervisor had not arrived. The officers continued to hover over Eric, radiating authority, while the crowd shifted uneasily. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Eric closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He thought of his team, thought of the mission ahead. They were counting on him. This was a detour, a distraction, nothing more. He had been through worse, and he would get through this too. The sound of murmured voices drifted through the crowd. A passenger, an older man with a concerned expression, stepped forward. "Is all this really necessary?" he asked, addressing the officers. "He's not resisting. Why are you treating him like a criminal?" The taller officer shot the man a warning glance. "Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you." The man hesitated, clearly wanting to say more but unsure if it would make a difference. He took a step back, reluctantly blending back into the crowd. Eric exhaled slowly, keeping his composure intact. Every part of him wanted to shout, to demand that they stop this madness. But he knew better. He knew that the only way out was through, and that meant staying calm, no matter what. Then, in the distance, Eric saw movement. A new figure emerged through the sea of passengers, making his way toward the scene. The officers straightened immediately, their postures shifting from aggressive to alert. The supervisor had arrived. The weight of the situation pressed down on Eric as he lay on the cold airport floor, his wrists chafed by the tight handcuffs. Around him, the murmur of the crowd grew louder, fueled by discomfort and indignation. The officer's knee still dug into his back, a constant reminder that, in their eyes, he wasn't a respected leader, just another suspect, pinned down, powerless. Eric turned his head slightly, catching sight of the approaching supervisor weaving his way through the sea of passengers. The man, tall and authoritative, wore the same navy blue uniform as the other officers, but his demeanor was calmer, more composed. He didn't rush to judgment, but there was still a guardedness in his expression, the look of someone trying to piece together a situation that had already spiraled out of control. The officers straightened, stepping away from Eric but leaving him on the floor in cuffs. They exchanged brief glances, as if silently preparing their version of the story to present to their superior. "Sergeant Daniels," one officer greeted with a slight nod, "we've got a situation. This individual left a suspicious bag unattended. When we questioned him, he became uncooperative." Eric didn't react. He knew this was how it would play out, the story carefully twisted to justify their actions, to make him appear as the problem. Daniels frowned, glancing down at Eric still lying prone on the floor. His gaze flickered to the confiscated backpack and the scattered belongings. "What's in the bag?" "Clothes, toiletries," the officer replied, "and these." He held up the sealed envelope containing the confidential documents. "Says they're classified." Daniel's eyebrows furrowed slightly as he considered the information. The crowd around them continued to grow, murmuring among themselves. Some passengers held up their phones, recording every second. Eric knew those videos would soon surface online, feeding a narrative that was quickly slipping beyond his control. Daniels knelt beside Eric, his expression unreadable. "What's your name, sir?" he asked, his tone more professional than the others. Eric met his gaze steadily. "Eric Gaines." Daniel's eyes flickered with recognition at the name, but he masked it well. "And what exactly is your business here, Mr. Gaines?" Eric gave him a measured look. "If you check with the airport's operations team, they'll confirm everything you need to know." Daniels glanced briefly at the officers standing over him. Their smug expressions faltered slightly, sensing that the situation might not be as straightforward as they had hoped. "I'll handle this," Daniels said curtly to his subordinates. "Step back." The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks, but eventually complied, stepping away reluctantly. Daniels stood, brushing off his uniform, and turned to one of the nearby officers holding Eric's phone. "Give him back his phone," Daniels ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer, clearly irritated by the change in tone, handed the phone back to Eric with a visible scowl. Eric took it without a word, carefully adjusting his position as Daniels continued to assess the situation. Daniels spoke into his radio. "Get me someone from operations on the line. We need this confirmed now." While Daniels waited for a response, the tension in the air grew thicker. Eric remained calm on the outside, but inside, frustration boiled beneath the surface. He knew his team would be waiting for him, wondering why their leader had gone silent. Every second wasted here was a second closer to potential disaster. The radio crackled, and Daniels received confirmation from airport operations. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of understanding, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Unlock his cuffs," Daniels said immediately, the weight of the situation dawning on him. The officers hesitated, clearly reluctant, but they obeyed, unlocking the cuffs with a metallic click. Eric flexed his wrist, feeling the circulation return, though the sting of the humiliation lingered. Daniels turned to the officers, his voice tight with restrained anger. "You've just detained the man in charge of a classified operation to prevent a terrorist threat." The color drained from the officers' faces. The smugness vanished, replaced by panic and disbelief. One of them opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel silenced him with a glare. Eric stood slowly, brushing off his clothes with deliberate calm. He said nothing, letting the weight of the revelation hang in the air. The officers squirmed under his gaze, realizing just how deeply they had miscalculated. The crowd, sensing the shift in dynamics, began murmuring louder. A few passengers cheered quietly, savoring the officer's embarrassment. Phones continued to capture every second of the unfolding scene, ensuring that this moment would not be forgotten. Daniels turned back to Eric, his expression contrite. "Mr. Gaines, I apologize for the actions of my officers. This should never have happened." Eric gave him a measured look, his expression unreadable. "What's done is done," he said quietly. "But I suggest you take a closer look at your team's behavior." Daniels gave a tight nod. "I'll personally make sure this is addressed." Eric didn't linger. He had no interest in watching the officers squirm or making a scene. His mission was still waiting, and every second counted. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the confidential documents within. Without another word, he walked away, leaving the stunned officers in his wake. As Eric made his way through the terminal, passengers parted before him, some offering apologetic smiles, others simply staring. He ignored them all, focused on the task at hand. His team was waiting, and the mission was far from over. But as he moved deeper into the terminal, Eric couldn't shake the lingering frustration. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one he had encountered too many times before. No matter how high he rose, no matter how competent he proved himself to be, there were always those who would see him as nothing more than a threat. It was a burden he had carried for years, and one he knew he would continue to carry for years to come. But he wouldn't let it define him. Not now. Not ever. As Eric approached the rendezvous point with his team, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from his second-in-command, confirming that everything was in place. The mission was back on track. Eric smiled faintly to himself. They had tried to derail him, but they had failed. He was still here, still standing, and still in control. And that was all that mattered. The murmur of the crowd grew distant as Eric walked away from the chaotic scene, his mind refocusing on the mission ahead. The weight of his backpack on his shoulder was a grounding reminder that despite everything that had just unfolded, his responsibilities were far from over. but the sting of humiliation remained, an ever-present echo of the countless times he had faced this kind of bias. Eric approached a quieter section of the terminal where his team was scheduled to rendezvous, but his thoughts remained on the scene he had just left behind. The officers' faces filled with panic and confusion as Sergeant Daniels revealed the truth, replayed in his mind. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw only a man, black and out of place in their eyes, and that had been enough for them to jump to conclusions. As he turned a corner, his phone buzzed again, a message from his second-in-command. They were waiting in the operations room, ready for his arrival. Eric quickened his pace. The mission could not afford any further delays. His footsteps echoed in the relatively quiet hallways leading to the airport's secure areas. He passed several airport personnel, none of whom gave him a second glance, exactly the way he preferred it. But the events of the past half hour still lingered in his thoughts. This was not just about what had happened. It was about what it represented, a constant reminder of the invisible hurdles he had to navigate on a daily basis. Arriving at a discreet side door, Eric pulled out his ID card and scanned it at the security terminal. A soft click followed as the door unlocked, granting him access to the operations area, a stark contrast to the bustling public side of the airport. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, more controlled, with screens lining the walls and airport personnel monitoring every corner of the facility. As he entered, his team, a small, highly trained unit, stood up from where they had been monitoring the situation. His second-in-command, Mason, approached with a concerned expression. "You okay, boss?" Mason asked quietly, his brow furrowed as he glanced over Eric's shoulder, likely imagining the chaos that had just transpired. "I'm fine," Eric replied, waving off the concern. "We don't have time to dwell on it. Where are we with the operation?" Mason nodded, though his eyes still lingered on Eric's wrists, where faint marks from the handcuffs were visible. "Everything's in place. The target is scheduled to arrive in 2 hours. We've tightened security around all key areas, and the secondary teams are stationed at the checkpoints as planned." Eric nodded, pushing the recent encounter out of his mind. There was no room for distraction. "Good. Let's make sure nothing slips through the cracks. We're not leaving anything to chance." As Mason briefed him on the latest updates, Eric's mind returned to the contents of his backpack. The sealed, confidential documents that the officers had almost opened contained critical information, not just about the mission, but about the terrorist threat they were working to neutralize. Had those documents been exposed, the entire operation could have been compromised. "We've also got eyes on the officers from earlier," Mason continued. "There's a bit of a stir going on about the whole situation." Eric exhaled sharply. "Let the internal affairs handle them. It's not our priority right now." Mason hesitated for a moment. "There's something else. Someone in the crowd filmed the whole thing. The video's already spreading online." Of course it was. In today's world, nothing like this stayed hidden for long. Eric suppressed a sigh, knowing that the video would only add to the fallout from the incident. While part of him wanted to let it go, to move past it, he also knew that the footage could become a catalyst for change, not just for himself, but for others who face the same kind of treatment every day. "I'll deal with that later," Eric said firmly. "Right now, the mission comes first." Mason nodded, respecting his decision, though the unspoken tension between them remained. Eric could tell his team was deeply affected by what had happened, but they knew better than to let it disrupt their focus. They had a job to do, and failure was not an option. They moved to a large screen on the far side of the room where live feeds from the airport security cameras played in real time. Eric studied the feeds closely, watching as travelers moved through the terminal, completely unaware of the intricate operation unfolding behind the scenes. His team had spent months planning every detail, from the positioning of undercover agents to the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies. It was all designed to ensure that their target never even realized they were being watched. But in the back of his mind, Eric couldn't help but think of the officers who had just humiliated him in front of a crowd. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to assert their authority without any regard for the truth. And now they would face the consequences of their actions. "Sir," one of the tech specialists called out from the corner of the room, "we've got the senior security officer from the airport on the line. He's asking to speak with you." Eric glanced at the monitor displaying the incoming call and nodded. "Patch him through." The screen flickered, and the face of Sergeant Daniels appeared, his expression a mix of apology and frustration. "Mr. Gaines, I want to formally apologize for what happened earlier. The actions of my officers were inexcusable, and we're conducting a full investigation into the incident." Eric's face remained impassive as he listened. "Your officers acted with bias and recklessness, Sergeant. Apologies won't erase what happened." Daniels nodded, his face tightening. "I understand. Believe me, this won't go unaddressed. We've already started disciplinary actions against the officers involved." Eric wasn't one for grudges, but this incident struck deeper than just personal insult. It spoke to a system that allowed such bias to thrive unchecked. He could see the fear in Daniel's eyes, fear of the fallout, fear of what this incident might cost him. "This isn't just about your officers," Eric said quietly. "It's about the larger picture. Incidents like this aren't rare, and they don't happen in isolation. They happen because of ingrained prejudice, and that's something that needs to change." Daniels swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, but Eric didn't soften his stance. He had lived through too many moments like this to let it go without pushing for accountability. "I'm not interested in retribution," Eric continued, "but I am interested in making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Daniels nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. "We'll do everything we can to make sure our officers are held accountable." "Good," Eric said, his tone firm, "because next time it might not end as well as it did today." With that, Eric ended the call, his gaze returning to the live feeds on the screen. The mission ahead loomed large, but the weight of what had happened still clung to him. As he turned back to his team, ready to refocus their attention on the task at hand, a sudden thought crossed his mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The incident would have lasting consequences, both for him and for those officers. But for now, he had a job to do. The airport hummed with activity, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. And as Eric resumed his place at the head of the operation, he knew that whatever happened next, he would face it head on, just as he always had. The echo of Eric's footsteps blended with the background hum of the airport as he left the operations room. His heart was steady, his mind focused on the mission. The humiliation from earlier still lingered, but it had been filed away in the back of his mind, compartmentalized like countless other moments of bias he'd endured throughout his career. Now it was time to move forward. But the consequences of that encounter were far from over. As Eric navigated through the airport, the news was already spreading. The video of his wrongful detainment had gone viral, shared across social media platforms and amplified by outraged voices condemning racial profiling. The familiar sting of exposure was present, but this time the public narrative was working in his favor. Passengers from the scene were posting first-hand accounts, and the truth about who Eric was, a high-level leader orchestrating a mission to prevent a potential terrorist attack, was spreading like wildfire. At the same time, the consequences for the officers involved were swift and severe. A senior administrator had informed Eric via secure message that an internal investigation had been launched and those responsible would face disciplinary action. For the officers, their smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the fear of losing their badges and careers. As Eric stepped back into the terminal, he saw the ripple effects firsthand. An announcement rang out over the airport speakers, apologizing for the earlier disruption. The crowd of passengers, still buzzing with conversations about the incident, parted as Eric moved through them. Some offered nods of acknowledgement. Others simply stared, recognizing him from the now viral footage. Eric's phone buzzed again. It was a notification from his second-in-command, Mason. All teams in position. Mission is a go. The message brought him back to the task at hand. The operation, the real reason he was here, was still his top priority. But before Eric could immerse himself fully in his work, he had one final matter to address. The officers who had humiliated him were still on duty, awaiting their fate. A few moments later, Eric found himself standing near a restricted area of the terminal, where the officers were being held temporarily until internal affairs arrived. Sergeant Daniels stood nearby, his expression a mix of frustration and regret. As Eric approached, Daniels straightened up, clearly aware that this was a moment of reckoning. "Mr. Gaines," Daniels began, his voice tight, "we're taking the necessary steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. The officers involved will be held accountable." Eric gave a curt nod. "Good, but it's not just about punishment." He paused, measuring his words. "It's about making sure this isn't part of a pattern, one that's been ignored for too long." Daniels shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "I understand." Eric's gaze hardened. "Make sure you do." Just then, the doors opened, and the officers who had mistreated Eric were escorted out. Their expressions were a mix of confusion, anger, and humiliation, a stark contrast to the arrogance they had displayed earlier. Eric stood tall, his posture unwavering as the officers were marched toward him. "You owe this man an apology," Daniels said sternly to his subordinates. "Right now." The officers hesitated, clearly reluctant, but the weight of their situation left them no choice. One by one, they muttered apologies, their voices low and hollow. "We're sorry, sir," one of them managed, though the words sounded forced. Eric regarded them silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting for his reaction. But Eric wasn't interested in retribution. This was about something bigger than just an apology. "You need to understand something," Eric said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any raised tone. "What you did wasn't just an insult to me. It was a reminder that there's still a long way to go in dismantling the kind of thinking that led to this moment." The officers shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "You don't have to like me," Eric continued, "but you will respect the people you serve, all of them. No exceptions." Daniels gave a sharp nod to the officers, signaling that they were dismissed. They walked away in silence, the weight of their actions hanging over them. Daniels turned back to Eric, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate the way you handled this," Daniels said sincerely. "Not many people would have shown this kind of restraint." Eric offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Restraint isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a necessity. With that, Eric turned and walked away, leaving Daniels to reflect on the lesson that had just been imparted. The mission was calling, and there was no more time to waste. Back in the operations room, Eric rejoined his team. Mason gave him a knowing look, but neither man spoke of what had transpired with the officers. The operation was now in full swing, and every team member was focused, their attention locked on the mission at hand. "Targets on approach," one of the tech specialists reported, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she monitored the incoming flight manifest. Eric nodded, his mind shifting seamlessly into tactical mode. Stay sharp, no mistakes. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was a tension Eric thrived on. Here, in the midst of a high-stakes mission, there was no room for bias, no room for prejudice. It was all about precision and execution, exactly the way it should be. As the target's flight touched down, Eric's team moved like clockwork. Agents in plain clothes positioned themselves strategically throughout the terminal, blending in with the passengers. Surveillance feeds tracked every movement, ensuring there were no surprises. Within minutes, the target was identified and discreetly intercepted. The operation unfolded smoothly without a hitch, a testament to the months of planning and the skill of Eric's team. When the dust settled, Eric allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The mission had been a success. Lives had been protected and a potential disaster averted. But as the airport returned to its usual rhythm, Eric knew that the real work was far from over. Later that evening, as Eric walked through the now quiet terminal, the weight of the day finally began to lift. The operation was behind him, but the encounter with the officers still lingered in his mind. It wasn't something he could simply forget, nor was it something he wanted to. But he also knew that dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. What mattered was what came next, the small, incremental changes that could turn moments of bias into opportunities for growth. It was a long road, but Eric had walked it before, and he would walk it again if needed. With one last glance around the terminal, Eric slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed for the exit. The world outside was waiting, and so was the next mission. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Eric knew one thing for certain. He would face them head-on, just as he always had. The next morning, the airport buzzed with its usual activity, but the events from the previous day lingered in the air. Conversations about what had happened to Eric Gaines were still circulating among the passengers and staff. The viral video of his wrongful detainment had sparked an online outcry, calling for accountability from the officers and the airport security team. In a conference room within the airport's administrative offices, a press conference was about to begin. Journalists, airport officials, and passengers affected by the incident had gathered to witness what would be a rare moment of public accountability. The officers involved in the incident stood on the platform, rigid and uncomfortable, flanked by their supervisor, Sergeant Daniels. Eric watched from the back of the room, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He hadn't requested this public apology, but the pressure from the viral video and the airport administration's damage control made it inevitable. Daniels had insisted that it was necessary to restore trust and demonstrate the airport's commitment to fairness. The microphone crackled to life as Daniels stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Thank you all for being here today. We are here to address the unfortunate events that took place yesterday involving Mr. Eric Gaines." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Daniels continued, his voice steady but laced with the discomfort of a man delivering unwelcome news. Our officers made a serious mistake in their handling of the situation. Their actions were not only inappropriate, but also reflective of biases that have no place in our law enforcement practices. On behalf of the airport security team, I offer a formal apology to Mr. Gaines. Daniels turned to the officers standing behind him, giving them a slight nod. One by one, the officers stepped forward, their faces pale with discomfort, and offered their apologies into the microphone. "We're sorry, Mr. Gaines," one of them muttered, barely able to meet Eric's gaze. Another officer, the one who had whispered the racial slur, cleared his throat and forced out the words. "I apologize for my actions and the way I treated you. It was wrong." Eric's expression remained calm and composed, giving nothing away. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see how he would respond. But he had already decided that this apology wasn't about him. It was about the message it sent to everyone watching. Daniels shifted awkwardly, glancing toward Eric. "Mr. Gaines, would you like to say anything?" Eric stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the faces of the officers, the reporters, and the airport staff. He could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of anticipation and unease. "This apology is a step in the right direction," Eric began, his voice measured and calm. "But words alone aren't enough. What happened to me is just one example of a larger problem, a problem that won't be fixed by apologies or press conferences." The room was silent, everyone hanging on his every word. "Real change requires action," Eric continued. "It requires accountability, training, and a willingness to confront the biases that exist within our institutions. It's not enough to apologize after the fact. We need to create systems that prevent these incidents from happening in the first place." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I didn't come here today for compensation or recognition. I came because I believe in holding people accountable, not just for their mistakes, but for the changes they can make moving forward." There was a murmur of agreement from the audience. Eric turned to Daniels. "I trust that you and your team will follow through on your promises to address this issue." Daniels nodded, looking more serious than before. "We will." Satisfied, Eric stepped back, allowing the press conference to conclude. The reporters began firing questions at Daniels, eager to turn this story into headlines. But for Eric, the moment was over. There was nothing more to be said. Later that day, Eric found himself back at the airport terminal, preparing to leave for his next destination. His team had successfully completed their mission, and now it was time to move on. As he walked through the bustling crowd, he noticed several passengers recognizing him from the video. Some nodded in support, while others whispered to one another. Eric paid them no mind. He had grown accustomed to the attention, both good and bad. What mattered to him was not the public's reaction, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, however small, had been served. His phone buzzed with a message from Mason. "Flight confirmed. See you at the next checkpoint." Eric smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The world was still far from perfect, and the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with more challenges. But he was ready. He always was. As he approached the gate, a young black man sitting nearby looked up and recognized him from the video. "You're that guy from the airport thing, right?" Eric paused, offering a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, that's me." The young man grinned. "You handled that like a boss." Eric chuckled softly, feeling a rare moment of lightness. "Thanks." He nodded to the young man and continued toward his gate, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The challenges would keep coming, but he had learned long ago that dignity and resilience were the greatest weapons he could carry. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal as Eric stepped onto the plane, leaving behind another battle won. The flight attendants greeted him warmly, and he settled into his seat, ready for whatever came next. The world might be full of prejudice, but Eric knew that with every step forward, change was possible. And as long as he kept moving, one mission at a time, there was always hope. With a deep breath, Eric closed his eyes, the hum of the airplane engines soothing his mind. The past was behind him, the future ahead, and Eric Gaines, as always, was ready. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. There's so much more to come. Stories that inspire, challenge, and resonate. Watch the next video by clicking right here and explore other powerful stories on our channel. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one.